Prince Edward, the most reserved member of the royal family, just shocked everyone, and the entire UK is reeling. During an emotional interview, Edward exposed decades of personal struggles that have shaped his life behind palace walls. For the first time, he spoke about the deep wounds caused by constant comparisons to his brother, revealing the impact those pressures had on his childhood and adulthood. The question now is what pushed him to speak out now, and how did the royal family react to his bold honesty? Join us as we take you inside the moments that changed everything for Prince Edward. Prince Edward dilemma. The royal family has a few troublemakers. The Prince Edward has never been one. People often called him the most reserved member of the British royal family. However, when he decided to make a damning revelation, it struck so many people like a cold splash of water. It was sudden, almost unreal, to see the prince, who had built a reputation for calmness for over 6 decades. For the first time, he allowed the world to see how much the past few years had drained him. It was not a dramatic admission, it was simple and wrong, and that made it even more powerful. Viewers later said they felt like they were watching a man step out of his own shadow. Public reaction to Prince Edward revelation was swift. People who had barely paid attention to him began to notice the sadness that had always hidden behind his smile. And what they found surprised everybody. Keep watching to find out. People pulled up old footage of Edward's state events, family gatherings and charity visits. They compared the Edward they used to see with the one speaking now. There was a new sadness in his eyes, and it made many realize how invisible he had been for most of his life. His role had always been quiet and supportive. Others were allowed their storms. He was expected to stay calm. Seeing the once steady man tremble even a little drew sympathy from the whole public. What could be wrong with the prince? Edward was the youngest child, the one who was rarely placed at the center of anything. He went to Gordonstown, like his brothers before him, and he later studied history at Cambridge. Yet the public rarely connected him with any major crisis of the royal family. He was the dependable one, who did not spark scandals, did not attract headlines, did not demand attention. Some experts described him as the family's quiet engine, always running, always present. The world had seen louder personalities in the royal household. It is clear now that something had been building inside him. Although he continued to perform his duties with the same energy as usual, something in his posture had changed. According to sources close to Edward, has been worried about Queen Elizabeth II. He had grown up watching her brace the storm of rulership. Edward was the closest among her children. The Queen held more than 15,000 official engagements during her reign, and her workload continued well into her 90s. Edward had tried to follow that example. He saw her consistency as a personal strength. The more he wanted to honor her by living with the same firmness, the more her strength became the pressed on his own shoulders. Edward had promised himself that he would hold the family together in whatever small way he could after her passing. It was a promise made quietly on the day she died. The same day the United Kingdom recorded more than 10 days of mourning and nearly 250,000 people queued to see her lying in state. He wanted to match her common sense of duty. Yet each month after her death made him feel the cost of this vow. The responsibility began to settle into his bones. He would wake with the feeling that something precious was slipping away, and he did not know how to stop it. But that wasn't all. The unity that the Queen had kept for decades began to fade quickly after her passing. It all started small: fewer family photographs, fewer joint appearances in public, less contact across the different branches of the family. People around the palace confirmed that the warmth that used to sit in the room when she walked in was no longer there. Without her, every disagreement felt bigger. Every distance grew a little wider. Edward watched the tension rise between Charles, Edward William, and Harry. What had once been manageable disagreements became more serious. The discussions about the future of the monarchy created new pressure points. The fallout between William and Harry still reverberated around the world, with surveys showing that the British public no longer trust the brothers' relationship. Another problem was Edward's situation. It not only affected the public image of the family, but for the emotional ties within it. Charles had his own battles as he tried to steer the institution during a time of fewer working royals and a stronger demand for transparency. Each man faced a stay form of his own, and each storm added to the tense atmosphere that Edward walked through every day. Edward took all of this in quietly. He did not argue about anything. He did not choose sides. He simply absorbed it, and the weight grew inside him. There were more closed doors, more carefully timed arrivals, more controlled conversations in the palace. The place that once felt like home began to feel like a museum where everyone tried not to disturb the silence. The emotional distance became the part he struggled with the most. It was not a public crisis, it was the private atmosphere that cut deepest. He moved through rooms where the memory of laughter still lived, yet the present air felt tense. He would look at portraits of the Queen and feel both comfort and pressure. He would think of her calm, her steadiness, her ability to bring people together, and he would wonder why he could not recreate the same feeling. That quiet question became the seed of his slow breaking point. The harder he tried, the closer he drifted toward the edge of his patience. This was not an explosive collapse, it was a slow internal shift. But what many people did not notice is that Edward's current situation is not an isolated incident. Let's walk down memory lane back to his childhood, where it all began. Stay with us, because this is just the beginning. Prince Edward's childhood and upbringing. During his early years, Prince Edward was the quiet child of the house. Charles was the heir everyone watched and had confidence that pushed her through any room. Edward attracted attention without even trying. Edward realized very young that he was different. He did not fight for space. He preferred to sit back, listen, and watch the world move around him. People sometimes mistook that for shyness, but it was really a sensitivity he never learned to hide. He noticed things other children ignored: the way a person shifted when they felt uncomfortable, the way the staff looked tired after long days, the way his mother carried her crown with a balance that hid the strain under. He paid attention to moods and silences. He remembered small details that no one expected him to notice. These habits shaped who he would become and quietly pushed him further into a life of observation. His closeness to the Queen grew naturally from that. She understood that he was not built like the others. He often felt like she could see the noisy confusion inside him even when he said nothing. He found comfort in her presence. When life in the palace felt too heavy with expectation, he would stay near her because she made the atmosphere better. He admitted during an interview that Queen Elizabeth once told him that she knew he saw the world differently. She meant it as encouragement. But even as a child, he sensed that this kind of vision could feel like both a blessing and a curse. As he grew older, the question of where he fit into the royal order became harder to ignore. The hierarchy in the family was clear and public. Charles was the future king and had already built a strong identity. Edward drew much of the attention both inside and outside the palace. Edward often felt like the extra piece in a set that already looked complete. He did not want to compete with them. He wanted to find his lane, something that matched the way he saw life. But defining that path was more difficult than most people realized. Those struggles were not dramatic, they were small and constant. He tried joining the Royal Marines in his early 20s, but left training after 4 months. Critics did not hold back. Newspapers described him as lacking stamina. If you find that shocking, then wait until you hear his next move. Few years after the Marines saga, he ventured into television production with Ardent, and the company became the subject of jokes, and several British papers. Some pointed out that his programs rarely pulled in high ratings, and that his company once filmed near Prince William at university against guidance from the palace. The media hyped every misstep because of who he was. Each headline chipped away at his confidence. He tried to move past it, but those moments settled quietly inside him and influenced how he judged himself. Then came Sophie. When he met her, his life changed in a way he never expected. She understood his kind of gentleness. She provided him with something he had never had, and steady supply, which was emotional safety. She did not treat him like a background figure, she treated him like a man who deserved space. In 1999, their wedding was watched by more than 200 million people, yet he did not feel overwhelmed that day, because she was there beside him. Having her meant he finally had a person who saw him clearly and held him in a way the public never did. With Sophie he found balance. He made it possible for him to build a life that allowed him to be the version of himself he actually liked. They worked together on charities, they supported causes without global fanfare, and made meaningful changes. People saw how he relaxed around her. His siblings noticed it too. It was as if the soft parts of him finally had room to breathe. Still, the comparisons never stopped. Charles owns the crown and continued her duty, with more than 500 engagements in several years. Edward remained the center of public scrutiny long before the most serious controversies began. Edward sat quietly beside all of it, doing his work and hoping the world would one day see him as more than the spare sibling in the shadows. The insecurity did not rule his life, but it showed up in moments when cameras were too close, or when critics compared the brothers again. He knew how he was perceived. He wished people understood that the quieter members of the family had their own duties too. Then something happened that left him shattered. It was the death of Queen Elizabeth. According to Apolka sources, the Queen's death reopened every old insecurity at once. She had been the one person who understood his softness, not as weakness, but as a part of his nature. Losing her felt like losing the only anchor that had held him steady since childhood. The funeral was watched by more than 4 billion people around the world. And for Edward, it was simply overwhelming. He stood beside his grieving siblings. But his grief was about his identity as much as his love for her. He felt the absence of her presence more deeply than he expected. Without her, the palace felt different. And he felt vulnerable. After her passing, something he had buried for years started pushing its way to the surface again. The emotional cost of life inside the monarchy, the one he had learned to swallow since childhood, returned, but this time he could no longer push it away. It was not anger, it was not fear, it was pressure, and the pressure got to its boiling point during a recent meeting of the royal family. What we are about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about Edward. Stay with us. Prince Edward's confrontation with King Charles. Recently, King Charles called a meeting of the royal family. There was no ceremony, no fanfare, just a meeting in a room. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old carpet, the kind of smell that always reminded Edward of long hours spent walking the corridors in his youth, observing and thinking quietly. The stakes for high. Public concern had been growing and the royal family needed to appear united, yet the atmosphere was full of frustrations and Edward could feel it all settling on him almost before the meeting even began. When King Charles finally opened the meeting, he focused on keeping the family aligned and the public reassured. He spoke about unity, about the importance of every action being measured and disciplined, about guarding against any misstep that might leak into public view. When it was William's turn to talk, he repeated almost everything his father had said. Everything was about appearances, about avoiding the slightest hint of vulnerability. Edward listened, noticing how much emphasis William placed on perfection and restraint. Every word reminded him that the family had been trained to prioritize image above peace. Harry did not attend the meeting. No one mentioned it outright, yet Edward could feel the gap it created. Everyone knew that a piece of the family was missing. He could see the worry on Charles' face. The absence made every remark about family unity feel like an intentional facade. And it stirred a deep unease in Edward. Then came the moment that would crack the calm as part of Edward's restraint. Charles stated calmly and matter-of-factly that some royal relationships were beyond repair. The words hit Edward like a physical blow. He could feel the air around him change, and something inside him shifted. He had been a quiet observer, dealing with inner storms and personal frustrations for years. But this felt different. This was a declaration from the head of the family, a statement that some connections were no longer worth nurturing, no longer worth protecting. The statement left Edward with a sudden urgent need to respond, and that was the moment Edward did something that left the whole family. "I'm in shock. Stay tuned, because the story is about to get wild." Edward spoke about emotional honesty, about the need to recognize feelings rather than burying them in the pursuit of perfection. He criticized the family's obsession with appearances and reminded them that it often came at the expense of genuine connection. For the first time, Edward openly challenged the family, confronting the rigid structure and the emotional coldness that had long governed their interactions. People who witnessed the meeting noted that Charles' eyes grew wild. William changed his posture, and Camilla looked away briefly, uncertain how to respond to the breach of protocol. The outburst did not end there. Edward spoke of the emotional cost of living behind the walls of the palace, of acting perfect while feeling deeply sick. He spoke of moments when he had watched the family fractures silently, when he had wished for warmth and connection that seemed forever just out of reach. When he finished, Edward could see the shock on the faces of those around him. Even Charles, who usually commanded the room effortlessly, appeared caught off guard. William, who prided himself on control, could only stare. Camilla was lost in the moment, but she did her best to look away. Edward realized that he had not intended to shock them so deeply, but the truth he told them could not stay buried any longer. Overwhelmed by their reactions, he left the room. He wandered at first around the corridors. He didn't even notice the staff moving quietly in and out of their duties. His mind was full of the tension, the challenge, the weight of speaking truth in a place where truth was often muted. He felt both liberated and terrified. Speaking had left his heart lighter, but it had also exposed a fracture that he could not yet repair. In the midst of wandering, Edward would soon find something that changed the story. Stay with us to find out what he found. Edward stood by the door of a quiet room and noticed a letter lying on a desk. It looked familiar. The paper was thick, the handwriting precise and deliberate, unmistakably the Queen's. He had seen her letters before, usually formal and dignified, but this one looked a bit different. It was deeply personal, addressed not to a role, but to a person. As he read, he felt her presence. The letter spoke of the importance of protecting the heart of the family, of recognizing that unity was not just about appearances or public image, but about emotional connection, about seeing each other fully even when it was difficult. She reminded him that strength was not only measured in composure or perfection, but in understanding, empathy, and the courage to speak and act with honesty. Reading the words, Edward felt reassured that the Queen had trusted him to carry something vital within the family. Her message reminded him that the responsibility of keeping the family emotionally intact was now partly his. That the quiet, sensitive, observant self he had cultivated was not a weakness, but a necessity. She acknowledged the complexities, the fractures, and the distance that had grown among his siblings, and she encouraged him to be a bridge. A presence that could nurture where others had become rigid. The letter made Edward pause for a moment. He realized that his challenge to the family, the words he had risked saying aloud, were only the beginning. He understood that protecting the heart of the family was not a one-time act, but a continuous, patient effort that required resilience, courage, and sensitivity. The responsibility would not be simple and the task was complicated, yet the Queen's letter gave him a quiet but undeniable direction. The meeting in the fallout had exposed fractures, tensions, and absences in the family that could no longer be ignored. His own voice had broken the long-held silence, and the Queen's words reminded him why that voice mattered. He slipped the letter into his pocket, and that was the moment he decided to confess. His confession will rock the nation as never before. Keep watching as we reveal the stunning details of Andrew's confession. Prince Andrew's shocking confession. In a recent documentary celebrating Queen Elizabeth's life and times, Prince Andrew dropped a bombshell that rocked the British people. Edward walked into the studio, composed on the day of the interview. He seemed confident, yet as Sophie noticed, he wasn't calm. She reached for his hand and reassurance. He nodded, faintly grateful, but the tension clung to him like a second skin. The cameras rolled, lights flickered, and the crew quietly prepared. The entire setup was meant to celebrate the Queen's legacy, yet Edward planned to speak not only about memories of her achievements. The conversation began lightly with familiar questions about the Queen's accomplishments. Edward answered, carefully, polite in word. His voice was calm, however, he was apparently strained to anyone paying attention. Then came a simple question about her personally, about her life behind the public eye. He paused, took a breath, and his gaze shifted slightly, as if recalling something. Then Edward dropped the bombshell. Edward spoke of a private conversation he had shared with the Queen near the end of her life. He described the moment as intimate and unguarded, one of those rare instances when a monarch let her family see through her fears, her hope, and her wishes. She had asked him to carry something forward to ensure that the emotional connection between her children, her grandchildren, and the family as a whole remained intact. She had tasked him with guarding the family's heart, not just its image, a responsibility that would demand vigilance, patience, and courage. But that wasn't all that happened. As Edward recounted the Queen's words, the emotion that had been held in check for decades finally surfaced. He admitted to feeling that he had failed.